So, Samhain, a Celtic festival, some traditions and customs, which is going to be a sort of rapid overview of this wonderful festival. To be quite honest, this is one of my favorite festivals in the year, coupled with its counterpart, which is Beltane, and we'll talk more about that later. So let's see if I can get this to turn. It certainly is an ancient Celtic festival. We have physical evidence of the celebration of Samhain from ancient times, and it comes from numerous sites, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and in Britain. And many rituals have grown up around this festival, which have become identified in the modern day observance of Halloween or All Hallows Eve. And I think there are various reasons why maybe the Christian church wanted to own this festival because of its importance, certainly to these isles. It is one of the 8 major festivals that belong to this thing called the Wheel of the Year. Now, this is worth a comment because most of you will be familiar with this Wheel of the Year idea, the fact that there are these festivals spread around this wheel. And depending on who you read and what you read about it and whose arguments you want to follow, this Wheel of the Year is either very modern or very old. I fall into Ronald Hutton's camp really on this one, where there's evidence for some of the festivals, but not as a consistent pattern. However, Jacob Grimm, who was actually one of the brothers Grimm, the Grimm fairy tales, who was a folklorist, actually referred to the Wheel of the Year. What I found. Oh, sorry, that's my watch. I referred to the Wheel of the Year in a book called Teutonic Mythology. And it's that model of the Wheel of the Year that was then developed in the 50s and early 60s by people like Gerald Gardner from the Wicca point of view, Ross Nichols from the Druidry point of view, and then later neo-pagan movements, adopted this way of breaking the year down into 8 major festivals, all of which have either an astrological or astronomical, I should say, an astronomical or an agricultural focus. So, Samhain fits in this. It's a sort of, it's the end of the harvest, really. Samhain is the last of the major harvest festivals. Lunasa, Mabon, and Samhain come together. It's the first harvest, second harvest, and the final harvest. And so agriculturally, it's the end of the harvest and celebration of all that has been completed. We move into Yule and go around, and then directly opposite Samhain, we have Beltane, which is my other favorite festival. And Beltane is really the opposite to Samhain, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So it's important that we try and put this in the context of what modern pagans believe, this Wheel of the Year. And each of those festivals has some specific meaning, but they're all tied into either the solstices and the equinoxes, which gives us 4 of the festivals, and the cross-quarter festivals, the Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa, are agricultural festivals. And put together, they make sense. It is obvious that some of these festivals were celebrated from ancient times, but not necessarily all of them. The reason I think this system is really useful for us is that we tend not to live according to the agricultural cycle. And so if we have this system, we are reminded of that agricultural cycle and the mythology that goes with it. So maybe we'll talk more about that. And as you know, on the membership site, there are 8 little booklets that go as part of your free gifts that talk about these festivals in more detail. For me, the reason Samhain and Beltane are kind of important, for me, they're the borders of light and dark. Samhain is the entering into the dark half of the year, and Beltane is entering into the light half of the year. So we can have that division of the year into a light half and a dark half, which makes all kinds of practical sense, especially if you're living close to nature. Obviously, the solstices mark the longest days and the longest nights, so they're times to celebrate. The equinoxes measure equal day and equal night. And as I say, Samhain for me really summarizes endings. It's the end of the harvest period. It's when you're starting to buckle down for the cold winters ahead and the things that go with that. And Beltane really for me is a festival of beginnings. And again, you no doubt have got your own associations with this, these ideas, which we can share later on. An important reference, I think, is something called the Calendrian calendar, which is the oldest Celtic lunar calendar that's in existence. There's an example of it there. It's found in fragments, and it was discovered in France. It's now on display in Lyon. It dates from the 2nd century. And what this calendar does, it shows you the months of the year that the Gaulish peoples, the ancient Celts, if you like, followed. And it's really interesting because rather than just having months, each of the month's names has some rather evocative descriptions. For example, Simonos, which is October, November, it's this time of year, actually means seed fall. Isn't that great? I love it. Domanios is the darkest depths, November, December. And Rulios means the cold time. And then January, February is a stay-at-home time. And February, March is the icy wind time. Cutius is windy time, although it's windy today, and so on through this. The shoots show, the bright time, the horse time. Again, that was horse trading and horse using claim time. And what's interesting is that the Calendrian calendar actually shows you that the calendar wasn't just a collection of specific dates to keep track of. There was a collection of specific actions or specific advice, things to either avoid or things to do. I like this very much, and we could talk a lot more about this, and we probably will do when we talk about the Celtic Wheel of the Year in terms of Ogham next time. So we know that Samhain does have a Celtic origin. We know it exists in Ireland and in Wales and in Scotland and in Cornwall and in Brittany as a major festival. What is fascinating is that some of the Neolithic tombs, passage tombs, actually are aligned to the sunrise at the time of Samhain, not of the solstices or the equinoxes, but Samhain. This picture is a picture of the Mound of Hostages on the hill of Tara, which if you've never been, it's a beautiful place to go. Just the hill is incredible. And it is aligned to the sunrise at Samhain, which kind of suggests it must have been important. That alignment is there for a reason. Samhain as a festival is first mentioned in Irish literature from about the 9th century. The thing about that, of course, if it's in the literature, then as an oral tradition, it's much older. Yeah? And it says that Samhain as a celebration was marked with great gatherings and feasts, and the ancient burial grounds were opened, which was seen as one of the sets of portals to the other world. More about that in a moment. The name for this particular time of year in the Calendrian calendar, which I say dates from 1st century, possibly relates to the word Samhain. And it is suggested that it was part of a 3-night festival in Gaulish tradition. And I think that's interesting. This was over 3 nights. We know that any celebrations that the Celts held were probably started at sundown on the night before and continued through the following day, which is why the Eve events, the All Hallows Eve or Samhain Eve, are important events. The day ran from sundown, the next day from sundown. So an important way of thinking about this. Now, we know about some of the things that may well have happened at Samhain from the stories that the bards told. And some of these stories have been translated, or they were translated in the 19th century, they contain the oral tradition. And one of the famous stories is the wooing of Ema. And it lists in that story, says that Samhain was the first festival of 4 festivals of the year. And those 4 would have been Samhain, it would have been Imbolc, it would have been Beltane, and it would have been Llunasa. The story itself is a lovely story. It's about the hero Cuchulainn, who wants to marry this lady Ema, and in later stories, Ema, in fact, is his wife. But in this cycle of stories, he has to undergo various challenges, which require him to be trained by a warrior woman in order to win his spurs. And in this particular story, the wooing of Ema, the story talks about that peace would be declared at Samhain. There'd be great gatherings where they held meetings and they feasted, they drank alcohol and held contests. The Celtic tribes were pretty good at holding contests, if you like, mini Olympian contests, which were about ways of showing power and strength. So this particular story, the wooing of Ema, was a particular story where we know something about what was going on at Samhain. The other story, called Cormac's Adventure, you notice I'm not trying the Irish, is that it says that a giant feast was held on Tara Hill every 7th Samhain, and every 7th Samhain, that feast was hosted by the High King of Ireland. And every 7th year, new laws and duties were ordained. Anyone who broke the laws established during this time would be banished. So now we have not only a kind of celebratory thing tied to the agricultural cycle, but we also have a community thing tied to the making and giving of laws and the ending of some laws. And if it came to it, the banishment of certain people who broke those laws. I kind of love this concept. The story of Cormac is a great story, and I won't spoil it in case you want to look it up. But basically, the story starts when Cormac, who is the king of Ireland, actually sees the vision of a glorious knight coming towards him, and this knight asks Cormac for his help. He asks that he spends a time with Cormac, and eventually Cormac is encouraged to grant 3 requests, because the visitor says he comes from an isle of plenty and he'll give the cups of plenty to Cormac. And so Cormac thinks this guy must be of the fairy folk or something, and Cormac agrees to these 3 requests, these 3 wishes, if you like. After a year, the visitor comes back and asks for the hand of his daughter. And Cormac, being noble, gives him the hand of his daughter. I won't tell you any more of the story because it's a plot spoiler, but to say that Cormac's adventure is to go into the other world, as we discover, to reclaim his daughter and his wife and the other thing that the strange visitor has taken. It's a fantastic story. Anyway, I'll leave you there. So in all this literature and in all of the folk tradition and in all of the records of the ancient Samhain festivals, we find a certain number of things that were really important. At Samhain and Beltane, bonfires were really, really important, and so were the rituals involving them. There's ancient records of these bonfires, but in the early modern era, they were still common in the Scottish Islands, Isle of Man, Mid Wales, and parts of Ulster. The fires themselves were sometimes called need fires or force fires. And the best way to think of these bonfires is they were ritual fires. There were specific rules for lighting them, specific woods had to be used. And unfortunately, many of the records of what those rituals were and what those ways of lighting what those woods were have been lost. The key thing about the bonfires is that one way to look at them is this idea of sympathetic magic, in that the fires themselves were meant to mimic the sun, either the sun's power of growth, which held back winter, or in the case of Beltane, the hastening of the coming of the sun. And so these bonfires were not only things that you gathered around for warmth, but they were ritual focal points where all kinds of other stuff associated with these festivals that we talk about in a moment were practiced. And again, it's a great example of perhaps sympathetic magic, the mimicking of the sun, the bringing the light from the sun, the fire of the sun to the earth, and celebrating it. In the northeast of Scotland, it was traditional for boys to go around the houses asking for fuel for the village. So the bonfire was a tradition, was a community effort. Yeah. And when the fire was lit, one after another of the youths laid themselves on the ground as near the fire as possible so as not to be burned, so they could let the smoke roll over him, while others ran through the smoke and jumped over the boy that was laying down. That, we can take that any way you want to, but there's something there about healing and warmth and community blessings, perhaps. In some areas, it appears that two bonfires were built side by side, and the people, perhaps with their livestock, would walk between the bonfires as a cleansing ritual. Samhain was a time when the cattle were brought closer to the settlement, and so they would have been brought through the bonfires to cleanse them. And of course, at Beltane, that was when the cattle were taken away from the homestead and let loose more on the fields, and they went through the same cleansing bonfires. The finding of cattle bones at these ritual sites is quite important, because the wealth was in the form of cattle. That's how the agricultural people judged their wealth, that the crops they had and the cattle that they could raise. It's interesting, and it's a sideline actually, but and I'll talk about this another time perhaps, but if you know anything about runes, you know that one of the runes in the Elder Futhark is called it's about possessions. That's the meaning of it, and it actually means cattle. And if you just understand that rune, that one little symbol, in terms of it means cattle and possessions, sorry, you're missing the point of what the cultural significance of that rune held at its time. And one of the problems we have when we try to interpret these ancient festivals is we see them through the eyes of the now, and we forget the cultural significance of some of these ideas, cattle being a main form of wealth, and therefore a sacrifice of cattle and the feasting on cattle had a much greater significance than we perhaps would give credit to looking at the now. People also took flames to the bonfire back to their homes, obviously, as burning bits of wood and stuff. And in the 19th century, in parts of Scotland, torches of burning turf or fir were carried somewise around the homes and the fields to protect them. So the power, the life-giving power of fire was taken into the homes. In some places, people doused the hearth fires on Samhain night, so that the only fire that was lit was the bonfire, and then they would relight the fire from the remains of the communal bonfire, bonding the community together. A 17th century writer claimed that this was an ancient tradition instituted by Druids. Don't know. But I like the idea that the fire is seen as a cleansing, and it's interesting that fire and the passing of light is a tradition that exists in many New Year festivals, which gave birth to the idea that actually Samhain was the Celtic New Year. If you think about what we said earlier, that on Samhain, not only were new laws created, but actually people made new commitments. Well, isn't that akin to New Year's resolutions? People used fire to burn away the old and welcome in the new. Isn't that kind of uh, echoes of the Christian New Year festival, which happens in January? So it's kind of interesting that some of these things are linked. I won't go as far as to say that Samhain was definitely the Celtic New Year, but I will say it was the end of the growing season. It was when you hunkered down for the dark part of the year. And for me, it makes sense that you review the harvest, whatever that is, the physical harvest, the emotional harvest, the practical harvest at this particular time of year. Now, because peoples were connected to the land and nature wasn't a very certain thing. And there has always been interest in seeing if we could find out the future. What does the future hold? This thing of divination, divining what may be. And it's not surprising that around Samhain, a whole host of divination traditions sprang up. The bonfires themselves may have been used in divination rituals. There are accounts of people using the fire to scry. Now, scrying is where you stare at look at an object and see patterns within it. You will know scrying from crystal balls, for example, or from black mirrors in certain kinds of traditions. But fire scrying is an art and an approach to seeking inspiration in and of itself. Now, could spend a long time talking about divination and fortune telling, and I think divination has a different. It's not about fortune telling. It's about self-discovery and about connecting to patterns. But that's another discussion. In Scotland, from the 18th century, again, probably much older tradition, we read of people creating a ring of stones around the fire. Stones, one for each person, were laid on the fire, perhaps on a layer of ash. And everyone ran round it, exalting the stones and exalting the fire. In the morning, the stones were examined. And if any were mislaid, it was said the person it represented would not live out the year. That's a pretty dramatic bit of fortune telling. The same tradition, by the way, took place in Wales. And in other parts of Scotland, sometimes the stones were actually scribed on and named in order part of this tradition. Apples and hazelnuts are long associated with Celtic mythology. We'll talk about the apple really, because the apple is associated in Celtic mythology with the other world, the Isle of Apples, or Avalon, if you like. And the hazelnuts, and we know from various Celtic stories, associated with divine wisdom. So that's where apple bobbing comes from, by the way. The idea that you're going to catch an apple, well, you're going to catch an apple, you're going to get an insight of what the other world can offer you by bobbing for the apple. I remember talking to somebody some time ago, saying that I think it's very interesting that apple bobbing is apples, which are about other world and immortality or mortality, and water, which is one of those associated with the other world, bodies of water associated with other worlds. So you bring apples and water together and you get apple bobbing for apples. Other traditions have apples hanging from rods on the ceiling, and the candles lit on one and the apple hanging on the other, and the robber spun round and everybody took turn to try and catch the apple with their teeth and not necessarily be burnt by the candle wax. Again, you managed to catch the apple. It was fortunate for you. You didn't catch the apple, then you went away with an ouch, as you tell the kids. We have probably all heard of the idea of peeling an apple in one long strip and tossing the peel over the shoulder, and it said to form the shape of the first letter of your future spouse, which I think is really interesting. I could never actually peel the apple in one long strip. I've no idea what that means. I've no idea what it portended, but yeah, there we go. If you put 2 hazelnuts near a fire, one name for the person roast them and one for the person they desired, if the nuts jumped away from the heat, it was a bad sign. But if the nuts roasted quietly, foretold a good match. Now, we're talking about these divination rituals, if you like, these divination approaches, in a way of that it's sympathetic magic again, isn't it? It's looking for links between the objects you're using to create divination and connections between you and your possible future, your possible path in life. One of the things that I'll say now, and we can talk about later, is that the concept of fortune telling or divination, I think, has been dumbed down in modern years. You know, the New Age festivals where you go for a reading, I think if we're not careful, that could dumb down the real power and the importance of divination and this so-called fortune telling, because it is a powerful, powerful way of connecting, and it's you that's connecting to whatever otherworldly beliefs you have, whatever otherworldly powers that are there. Another thing that happens in Halloween, and it's a bit like the Christmas pudding and the sixpence, but food would have been baked and with items in, and a person in the future was told by the item they happen to find in the food that they ate. So, you know, if they found a ring, it may have meant marriage. If they found a coin, it may have meant wealth. I just wonder how many people choked badly on some of the ideas, some of the items that were put into these cakes that were meant to be eaten during a celebration, especially if you've been drinking a lot of ale. Another thing, in Scotland, a salty oatmeal bannock was baked, and the person ate it in 3 bites and then went to bed in silence without anything to drink. Which, if you've had salty oatmeal, trying to eat it in 3 bites without having a drink is a challenge in and of itself. But the resulting dream from this practice, in which their future spouse offers them a drink to quench their thirst. So you get a dream, and the person offers you a drink in your dream. Actually, that's your future spouse. Egg whites dropped into water, and the shapes of the number of future children. That's interesting. And natural divination, children would chase crows and some of the things, other things, the number of birds that flew in a particular direction, they would actually be read. Now, the reason this is fascinating for me is that we also know, and it's been adapted in modern druidry, but the ovates, which the 3 groups in modern druidry are bards, ovates, and druids. The bards are the storytellers. They learn the stories and the poems, and they learn. Traditionally, they would have learnt the rules of poetry and all the sort of history that goes with their tribe. The ovates were the healers and the people involved in divination. The druids were the lawgivers, or the priests, if you like. The ovates, or the vates, as they were reported in Roman literature, were heavily involved in connecting to information from other sources. The divine inspiration that we've talked about as the Awen in Wales, or the Imbas in Ireland. This would have been taken over, if you like, by the spirits in order to talk constructively, creatively, and inspiringly about future events. So we do know that divination was part of the tradition, but at Halloween, of course, it meant that other people, the people who weren't trained, if you like, could actually have a go at seeing and sensing their own future. The other thing that became traditional around this time of year was mumming and guising, and it was seen as part of Samhain, but it then grew out to become part of a whole period of the dark part of the year. It was first recorded really in 16th century Scotland, and then in parts of Ireland, the Isle of Man and Wales. It's a long tradition. It meant people were dressing up in costumes, in disguise, reciting songs or verses in exchange for food. They would go from door to door, which kind of resembles the way that carolers would have gone round. But at this time of year, they would have gone round in order to bless or to encourage the community to stick together. And it evolved from a tradition. So mumming and guising in the 16th century evolved from a tradition whereby people impersonated the spirits or the souls of the dead and received offerings on their behalf. Now, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but the association with Halloween or Samhain and the dead, the spirits of the dead, has been a long association. And sadly, it's been misunderstood by, I think, many Christians, but also many modern interpretations of this festivals. One of the reasons that people would have impersonated the spirits or souls was that it protected you from them. So not only were you honoring the spirits or the souls of the dead, you were protecting yourself from them by engaging in mumming and guising. Now, the mumming tradition we see has been revived quite a lot in Cornwall. We find that we have various mumming groups, and most of their activities focus on the winter solstice. Galawan, which is one of the major festivals in Penzance, which has been revived, if you like, has mumming guilds marching through the street towards a sort of midwinter bonfire, and it's a beautiful sight to see, and it comes back from this point at which we needed to find a way to connect with each other in the community in a way that had relevance. In Scotland, young men went from house to house in masks, painted blackened faces, threatening to do mischief if they were not welcomed. It suggests the black faces were actually from the soot from the bonfires, and they wore that as protection. But this sort of 16th century and 20th century tradition of going around threatening to do harm potentially is the origin of trick or treating. Yeah, and it produces this idea that the dark part of the year was actually when chaos and misrule could overtake us. And so the idea of these unruly or misruly or lords of mischief that started to take over this part of the year was quite an important reference to the fact that it's dark, nature is scary, man, and if we give ourselves over to it, then we will actually be caught up in this terrible chaotic nature of this time of year. It is interesting that the Lord of Misrule and the idea of the mock mayors that we have in Cornwall, or the mock popes, extends right the way into the Christmas period in many places. And it is this reminder that the world can be turned upside down from light to dark. In some parts of Europe, it was not only traditional to elect a mock pope, therefore, but also somebody who would actually go around and cause deliberate mischief to remind you about how good things were. And in certain festivals, servants became kings, and for one day, all of the rich people had to serve the servants. Misrule. In parts of Southern Ireland in the 19th century, we see the reinvention, I think, of something called the hobby horse or the white mare, where a hoss will be created from a horse's skull, and it would be part of the guising activities, the parade through the villages. And again, the horse's skull reminding us of life and death. And we've seen that this hobby os tradition has really developed and is being reborn in lots of places. I mean, not only do we have the Padstow hobby os, which is the summer thing, but we've got various osses associated with the various guising groups in Cornwall, and they're growing up in various other parts where people are celebrating old traditions. It's interesting because, again, if underneath all of this, there are two things that come out. If you're wearing a mask or taking on the role of a mischievous spirit, or indeed of a hoss, you're not you anymore. I remember, in fact, Eve will probably remind me of who the people were, but one of the Great Pagan Federation meetings that were held in Bude, some people that were very much into this tradition talked about the fact that when you put the mask on, or you put the hoss on, you suddenly feel liberated to be as cheeky or as devilish as you want to be. Great point, isn't it? Because you're hiding your identity so you can take part in the revelry of the season. So I think that's really interesting. And secondly, it's this idea that within life there's death, and if we actually become too disconnected from death and treat it too much as something to be frightened of, then in fact maybe we're not living fully. We'll talk about that a bit later on, maybe. As Ronald Utton said, that if people are going around imitating malignant or shall we say mischievous spirits, it's a very small step to go from guising to playing pranks. And so we know that as far back as 1736, Mischief Night became part and parcel of the Samhain celebrations. And of course, if you think about Ireland and Scotland, the diasporas of people moving, where do they go to North America? They would have taken some of this guising and Mischief Night with them, and that may well be why Halloween in the American continent became the thing it did, because it was transported from the Celtic provinces. The jack-o'-lantern, I think, is really interesting. We know that if we think about Halloween or Samhain, we often get this idea of pumpkins carved with fit faces. In fact, the geysers, their traditional form of illumination on these nights was to carve turnips and mangel wurzels and have them hollowed out to take as grotesque faces, which again is part of this. It's mischief, let's scare people. It's mischief, let's put a bit of kind of fear into people, because fear can be a good thing, right? And then they got set on windowsills, and the people who made them said it was to chase away evil spirits or to attract evil spirits. Common in Scottish Islands, and they're found in Somerset. And by the 20th century, that's when they became called jack-o'-lanterns. And of course, when we were getting pumpkins, which are a bit easier to carve than turnips, but mangel wurzels, we started to use pumpkins. In America, where pumpkins maybe were more initially more easy to obtain, and that's why they became associated with Halloween. Calangaeth is the festival in Wales. It's the first day of winter in Wales, which is celebrated on the 1st of November. Remember, the Celtic year starts, the sort of Celtic days start before. So on the 31st, the 1st of November, it's the first day of winter in the Calangaeth celebrations. And it's when the spirits are aboard. It's something called Spirit Night. In Wales, there was a tradition to avoid churchyards, stiles, steps, ladders, and crossroads, since the spirits were thought to gather there. It's a harvest festival. That's how we know it today. One of the lovely things now, in the wheat harvests that we see, the second harvest, there's tradition of the last shock of corn being mowed down, and it's Iavi, and it's the spirit of the corn. Well, in Wales, if there was usually some final corn stalk standing, there was a bit of competition, where the harvesters would race to get the final straws. They would make a harvest mare out of the corn stalks, and the winner would take this mare and stuff it inside his clothing and try to sneak it inside the house. If the person the reaper got inside the house, then they were celebrated, and this corn dolly, for want of a better phrase, was hung as a place of honor, and the person themselves was honored for bringing that luck into the house. Of course, if you weren't successful, you were mocked. And again, this is the idea of the connection between nature and people living in the time, in the house. If you didn't grow your wheat and you couldn't protect your wheat, then you're going to starve, right? So it's all that kind of connection. But aspects of this festival have got rolled into what we now know as Halloween. And in Cornwall, Calanguave is the name of the festival. It's Allantide because of the big juicy Allen's apples that were there. And again, Allantide, Calanguave, is the first day of winter. Nos Calanguave is the evening of the first day of winter. And again, the Cornish festival was traditionally celebrated on 31st October and the following day time. It was common, when I first went to Cornwall, I could see it, certainly in Penzance, for Allen's apples to be part of window displays in some of the shops, linking back to that idea that this was Calanguave. There were also bigger festivals or guising festivals and stuff, but I think that's given way now to the sort of winter celebrations. Now, this is where we get this really interesting idea. The Samhain festivals, the Calanguaves, the Allantide, and the Welsh festivals, were well established as harvest festivals. So the Christian church, when it wanted to Christianize these, what it did was it made Allantide or Samhain Hallows Eve, and it was All Hallows Eve, which was the evening before All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day was a celebration of all those people that had been canonized, and it was actually moved. I think it was initially in March, but one of the popes moved it to coincide with the Samhain festivals, so that it was a Christian spin. And I think at that point, when that happened, we started to see, should we say, the negative association with connections with the other world and connections with spirits, which was always part of Samhain. So I can't really finish this off without a few. I'm not sure I understand. A few. Sorry, that's my watch telling me it doesn't understand. Nor do I really. Without just mentioning a few things of the importance of the other world in Celtic mythology. In Irish mythology, there are several descriptions of the other world, from the land of young or the land of youth to the lands under the waves, to the plain of delight, the one here, to the silver cloud plain, and Isle of Apples, Avalon. There's a link to that. In Welsh mythology, it was kind of simple. They called the other world Anan or Anwyn. The F there is the Welsh spelling, so Anun or Anun. And the idea is that this other world could be visited, and it could be opened. The gateways to these worlds could be opened at certain times of the year. Guess when? Samhain and Beltane were the periods of the year between the light and the dark and the dark and the light, where the gateway to these other worlds was opened, and mortal people could travel there or visit there or receive inspiration from there. There are numerous stories that come from written down in the 9th, 10th century, but they obviously go back much further, of heroes or travelers falling asleep on fairy mounds and dreaming or being taken to the other world, the underworld, of mists descending on hills and the mists leading people into this other realm where they experience truth, or they get inspiration, or they're given some kind of gift. The water, as I mentioned before, water was a really important liminal space between the land and water, was a very important space between the land that we live on and that which is underneath the land, an other world, which is why the Celts in particular made sacrifices to water. Without getting too sidetracked, the idea of the Lady of the Lake and the sword Excalibur being thrown into the water can harken back to traditions where warriors did give offerings to the waters of their weapons. A major find was on the Isle of Anglesey, when they were draining some of the swampland for extension of the RAF base there, and they found one of the biggest caches of Celtic gold work and swords that were left as offerings in this place. The other liminal space would have been the top of mountains between the land and the sky, if you like. And so any journey that takes you across water or up into mountains towards the sky would have been potential ways to get into the other world. If you've read Marion Zimmer Davis, is it The Mists of Avalon? She has a wonderful way of describing the way that these worlds coexist, that there is a thin veil between the worlds where the magical world and the everyday world coexist. And that's an important point to come back to in a moment. So at Halloween, the veil between the worlds is thinnest. The Celts worshipped their ancestors. They believed that if they forgot their ancestors, they would forget themselves. They were very connected to where the histories of their past had brought them, which meant, of course, that welcoming your ancestors back from beyond the veil was actually quite a wonderful and positive thing to do. It wasn't a scary thing. In the Irish mythology, it is believed that the Tuatha De Danann, which were when we looked at the Cauldron of Posey, Tuatha De Danann were the fairy folk that ruled Ireland and were actually displaced. They went into the other world, and that's where the fairy folk now live. So if you wanted to connect with kings and queens of the Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, you would go to places where they might be in order to seek their wisdom, hence the stories we mentioned earlier. It was a wonderful thing and a scary thing, because the other world, as far as being mortal is concerned, was a great place to visit, but a really bad place to stay. In Welsh mythology, you have a similar kind of thing, with Awen Annwn being this other place that you could access through ecstatic vision, and again, working in these spaces that were liminal. It's the other world. Various creatures were seen as signs of the other world. The white stag, or the stags, were an important sign that the other world was there. Mists were there, and as I say, they've become associated with Halloween in the sense, or Samhain, in the sense that if you wanted to, you could choose to visit the fairy folk or visit the ancestors and celebrate the ancestors, and more importantly, invite the ancestors and the fairy folk to be with you. Modern Druidry, which I find is fascinating, has this idea of three worlds: land, sea, and sky. So whereas modern Wiccans, which is may cast circles and call to elements, Druids tend to think in terms of the three worlds: land, sea, and sky. And these land, sea, and sky, of course, are three realms. There's the material realm, there's the underwater realm, the underworld, and then there's the higher realm of spirits. And it dates back, that idea dates back to the ancient Gauls, who divided uh, their cosmology into three worlds: an upper world, um, the living world, and the lower world, or the dark world. Descent into the abyss, or raising yourself into the level of the shining ones by climbing mountains. I love this concept, but the important thing to remember, and this is where we're going, is that in Celtic mythology, these three worlds were not about transcendence, which is the Christian idea of going up or descending into a hell. These three worlds, these realms, coexisted, which this ancient carving here, which actually comes from Knowth, near Newgrange, where if you, again, another place to go and visit, but Knowth has got these incredible Neolithic cave paintings of these interlocking spirals. And if you imagine that at the center of these interlocking spirals, here somewhere, is where we are standing every day. And depending on where we look and how we look and the ring we choose to travel, we can be in any of those three worlds. So the idea that Samhain was about where the veil was thinnest, it just meant it was easier to cross over or travel between the worlds. Same with Beltane, easier to travel between the worlds. But these worlds are always there. It's a lovely idea that an Irish idea suggests that you can see the fairy folk and the leprechauns at the corner of your eye only. Well, that's because the corner of your eye is where the other worlds exist. It's across these boundaries. And if we look directly at them, we miss them. And I love that concept. So however you choose to celebrate Samhain, Halloween, have a think about some of these ancient ideas and traditions, and see where they can apply with your life now. Many people I know, many modern pagans, if they don't go out and celebrate as a festival, they will have a quiet, reflective evening, probably sitting in candlelight, but they will also reflect on their ancestors, their personal histories, and the seeds they've sown and the harvest they've reaped. And I think that's as good as any place to stop. So when you can actually choose to celebrate your Halloween, maybe think back and have a look at this talk again.